Shalom TV's coverage of the 10th anniversary Limmud conference is made possible in part by a grant from Dr. Naomi Vilko, in honor of her mother, Olga Vilko, and in memory of her father, William Vilko.
My name is Rachel Rosenthal, and actually, I didn't tell anyone this, but I'll tell you because you're the ones who show up. This is my 4th time teaching this weekend, and this is actually my favorite cheer. So you chose well, so well done. And the reason why this is my favorite is because super cool person that I am, I have a favorite minor character in Tanakh. Maybe some of you also have one of those, and my favorite minor character in Tanakh is Ploni Almoni, who shows up in the book of Ruth. And the reason why he's my favorite is because I find it really interesting that he has no name. So for those of you who are not familiar with Ploni Almoni, we'll meet him in a minute, but Ploni Almoni is basically the equivalent of so-and-so, or John Doe in English. John Doe, yeah. Meaning it's a name that is not a name. I once told my father that I want to name my kid Ploni Almoni, and he said, I hope you marry someone who has common sense. So we'll keep our fingers crossed for that one. But the reason why I find it really interesting is first of all, because in Tanakh, names are incredibly important. If any of you have spent any time in Tanakh, for example, in the narrative of Yaakov's sons, you have this rapid succession of one son born after another, after another, after another. But what you see in those stories is that, with the exception of Dinah, there's a name given for each, a reason given for each of their names. That their names are not sort of just chosen, but they are significant to the moment in which the person is living. So that's the first reason I think it's interesting, that we have a character who specifically doesn't have a name. And the second reason I think it's worth noting is because it's just as much work to give someone specifically not a name as it is to give them a name. And so to me, it seems intentional that the author of this text would call this person Ploni Almoni rather than recording their name, because actually it seems easier to just say, oh, and then Shmulik said whatever. And so the fact that the text doesn't say that, I think, is very significant. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at some of what Chazal, the rabbis as they're known, the authors of the Midrashim, how they respond to this character of Ploni Almoni. And then I want to look at it specifically in dialogue with the narrative that we see in the 38th chapter of Bereshit, which is the story of Yehuda and Tamar. A lot has been made on the connections between the book of Ruth and Yehuda and Tamar. If any of you had the opportunity to hear Alana Steinhain speak on Saturday night, she was talking about the ways in which Tanakh is in dialogue with itself. Or if any of you have heard Judy Klitzner speak or read her book, Subversive Sequels, or heard my teacher, Rabbi David Silver, these are, the idea that Tanakh is in dialogue with itself is very much one that is, it's in vogue right now, I think, because it's really true. And that when you read these stories, if you read them carefully, you see that they are retelling and responding to one another. And so it's very clear that the book of Ruth is responding to the story of Yehuda and Tamar. And of course, they are linked up in that Boaz, who will marry Ruth in the end, he is a descendant of that relationship between Yehuda and Tamar, of one of their 2 sons, Peretz. So all of these pieces kind of come together, and what I want to think about today is we have Ploni Almoni on one hand, and we have Tamar on the other hand, and I actually think that those 2 characters are sort of responding to one another. I mean, Ploni Almoni responding to Tamar more, which I know sounds like a strange thing to say, so just stick with me and we'll see how it works, okay? So let's start in the beginning, which is actually towards the end of the book of Ruth. So just a very brief summary in case you're not familiar. First of all, if you haven't read the book of Ruth, it's the most extraordinarily beautiful book. It's only 4 chapters long. I really recommend that you read it. So just a little plug. But the brief summary is there's a woman named Naomi. She leaves Eretz Canaan because there's a famine. This is a common trope throughout Tanakh. And she and her husband go to Moab, where both of her sons marry Moabite women. We'll see, maybe that's a problematic thing that they do. That's going to be one of the things we're going to think about. Both of the sons die while there, and Naomi's husband also dies. And when the time comes for her to go back to Eretz Israel, her daughter-in-law say, we want to come with you, right? Her 2 daughter-in-laws are Ruth and Orpah, and they say, we want to come with you. And she says, no, 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 there's no life for you there. Even if I had another son for you to marry, it would take so long for him to grow up. You should stay here with your families, and I'll go back. And Orpah goes back, but But Ruth says, I'm staying with you. And that very famous language of Amech ami ve'Elohayich Elohai. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. And Ruth is often thought of for that reason as sort of the first official convert. And she goes with Naomi. And then we get into this very complicated area of levirate marriage. So to greatly oversimplify levirate marriage, essentially if somebody dies and does not have a child, their wife is supposed to marry their brother. And the first child born of the union between the wife and the brother is considered to be the child of the dead husband. It's sort of a strange thing, not something we do anymore, probably for the best. Brother-in-law, thank you, yes, not her brother, her husband's brother. Yes, and so basically part of what they try to do when they go back to Canaan is find a redeemer, find someone who can marry Ruth and sort of carry on this family line. So that's where the story is picking up. So could I get a volunteer to read for us, please? We'll work out of the English, but the Hebrew is there as well. Ruth chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. Yes, please.
Meanwhile, Boaz had gone to the gate and sat down there. And now the redeemer who Boaz had mentioned passed by. He called over, "Come and sit down here, Ploni Almoni." And he came over and sat down. Then Boaz took 10 elders of the town and said, "Be seated here." And they sat down. He said to the redeemer, "Naomi, now returned from the country of Moab, must sell the piece of land which belonged to our kinsman Elimelech. Though I thought I should disclose the matter to you and say, acquired in the presence of those seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you are willing to redeem it, redeem. But if you will not redeem, tell me that I may know. For there is no one to redeem but you, and I come after you." So
part of what happens is if you're the closest inheritor, you also get to inherit their portion of the land. So it's not only about the wife, but it's also the property. So far, Boaz is presenting this as, oh, you're going to get this land, right? So this is good news for Ploni Almoni. So what happens next?
"I am willing to redeem it," he replied.
Great, free stuff for me. This turns out really well, but Boaz continues. Go ahead.
Boaz continued, "When you acquire the property from Naomi and from Ruth the Moabite, you must also acquire the wife of the deceased, so as to perpetuate the name of the deceased upon his estate." Right,
by the way, field comes with wife, just so you know. He sort of drops it in there at the last minute. And at this point, it is worth noting that Boaz and Ruth have spent some time together. She does spend a night sleeping at his feet, so we could think about what that might mean. So it's possible that he has a little bit of bias in the matter. We'll put it that way for now. Okay, continue on, please.
The redeemer replied, "Then I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own estate. You take over my right of redemption, for I am unable to exercise it."
Okay, good. And you'll notice that throughout this story, he's called Ploni Almoni. He's called Hagoel, the one who will redeem. But his name is never mentioned. And as I said in the beginning, I wouldn't read a tremendous amount into that, except it seems easier to give him a name. And I don't know if any of you, when you read through this story, feel like it's an intentional choice to not give it a name, but that's sort of how it feels to me. And Ploni Almoni often sort of gets skipped over because he's kind of he's a road bump in the happy ending of Ruth and Boaz ending up together, right? He's just an obstacle they have to overcome. It's like the last 20 minutes of the romantic comedy. Something happens and you think they're not going to be together, but in the end it works out. And so I think also the notion of perpetuating a name is actually very important. And that's part of the reason that I think it's interesting that Ploni doesn't have a name, right? Because he chooses not to perpetuate the name of Elimelech, his name is not perpetuated, which is sort of an interesting thing, right? The rabbis really like this idea of mida keneged mida, measure for measure, or what goes around comes around. That's something that they're interested in. And this, I think, is an example for it. And I agree. I don't think Ploni is a bad guy. I think Ploni is he's average. He's an average sort of guy. But in Tanakh, being average doesn't get you so far, right? You don't get written into kind of the greatest book in history by being average. And so therefore, there's a sense that we're not going to tell you who he is because he chooses not to perpetuate a name, and therefore what that means is his name is not perpetuated. And that doesn't mean he goes on to live a terrible life where bad things happen to him and he's never happy again. But it does mean that in this particular narrative, he gets explicitly written out. Maybe. We'll see. There's actually a dispute about that. There's actually a midrash that says that God sends Ploni Almoni along at that time because Boaz is trying to kind of do the right thing. And so God looks at it and says, well, Naomi and Ruth did the right thing, and Boaz did the right thing, so I'm also going to do the right thing. And I'm going to send you Ploni to kind of make this process happen, which is interesting. This notion of God as a partner in this process, I think, is sort of a beautiful thing. Because we do, when we talk about marriage in Judaism, there is this sense that you build a house and that God is another presence dwelling in that. And so that's even God wants them to end up together at the end, right? It's sort of a nice thing. And Rashi actually, when he comments on this, on the fact, Rashi notices obviously that his name is Ploni Almoni because it's strange. It's a strange thing, and he says he was named this because he was not going to redeem. Meaning, it's specifically that the author of the text does not include his name because he's not going to redeem. But what we're going to see in Root Rabbah, which is a fairly late collection of Midrashim, it's among the later of the Rabbahs, that in Root Rabbah, there's actually a dispute about Ploni Almoni and who he is. So can I get another volunteer to read? We're down at the bottom of page 1, Ruth Rabbah 7:7. Yes, Nora.
Called over and said, "Come here, Ploni Almoni, so-and-so." Rav Yehoshua ben Levi said, "Ploni Almoni" was his name. Rav Shmuel bar Nachman said, he was ignorant about the words of Torah. He said the first ones, Naomi's sons, wouldn't have died if they hadn't taken her. And I'm going to go and take her? God forbid. I'm not going to mix them up with my offspring. I'm not going to mix waste amongst my sons.
Okay, so pause there for 1 minute. So I think Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi here is very interesting. That he actually says that someone actually did what I had threatened to do, what my father hopes that I does it. Someone named their kid Ploni Almoni, right? So that's one possibility, is that actually this is just his name. I imagine somewhere in the world there's someone named John Doe. I don't know him, but he probably exists somewhere, and he probably gets a lot of jokes made about his name, and I feel sorry for him. But I think Shmuel bar Nachman's point is interesting. So the one piece of background before we read on is that it says in the 33rd parak, the 23rd parak of Devarim, that you're not supposed to marry anyone from Moab or Ammon. That even up to the 10th generation, which is the Torah's way of saying forever, you never intermarry with Moab and Ammon. And the reason given by the commentators there is because they didn't give water to the people when they were walking through the wilderness. Because mind you, Bnei Israel went to war with a lot of people. But Moab and Ammon are an interesting case because they're actually related to Bnei Israel. They are the two, they come from people named Ammon and Moab, who are the sons born of Lot's incestuous relationship with his daughter, following the destruction of Sodom. So they're kind of intimately linked to us in a way that the other nations aren't. But it seems that converts from Ammon and Moab are not allowed, and that you're not allowed to mix with them. And so Ruth is a Moabite. And so part of what Ploni is responding to here, according to Rav Shmuel bar Nachman, is that he's basically conjecturing that the reason why the sons died in the first place was because they didn't follow this precept of not marrying from Ammon and Moab. Okay, so and in fact, but the Midrash goes on to say, read me the last piece, please. And he didn't know that a Chiddush.
Know that a Chiddush had been found in the Halachah outlawing marriage to Moabites and Ammonites. Ammoni male, but not Ammonite female. Moavi male, but not Moabite female.
Okay. So they're working pretty hard here, yes? I'm interested to kind of know what you think of this, because I look at this and I feel like they're sort of struggling. They're like, okay, we want to make it okay that Boaz marries Ruth, because you know what? You know who's going to come from that union? David HaMelech. You know who's going to come from that union? Mashiach, right? This is a big deal. And throughout Tanakh, actually, you do have really important people born from seemingly illicit unions. And there's been a lot of work done on that area. And the rabbis actually also pick it up in the Gemara. They link, for example, Rachav, who is the prostitute who helped save the people during the conquest of Jericho. They say, oh, she converted and married Yoshua, and 10 prophets came from her. So this is sort of a trope you see all along. Nero, the Caesar of Rome, converted to Judaism and was the grandfather of Rabbi Meir in the eyes of the Talmud. I would not vouch for the historical accuracy of any of this. But there is this sense that sometimes seemingly transgressive relationships lead to kind of the most important people. And so, but Rav Shmuel bar Nachman is working hard here because he wants to understand why Ploni Almoni is problematic, rather than actually maybe following a mitzvah from the Torah. Because it actually is not unreasonable for him to say, well, we're not supposed to marry these people, and maybe that's why he died, and I'm going to learn a lesson from that, because there is a sense that like God kills you if you marry people in improper ways. And so maybe this is why it happened, right? So I'm not going to take up with this. I don't want to die. I don't want to endanger my estate. And it's actually sort of reasonable, and it's interesting because what this kind of reminds me of is like the people who always like to be kind of, they want to show how frum they are by adding like layers of chumrot on chumrot, right? Stringencies on stringencies on stringencies that actually don't necessarily have any basis in anything that's happening in the halakha. And that's sort of the rebuke here of that Shmuel bar Nachman is given. It's that he knows about the law about Moab, but if he actually knew, he would know that it doesn't apply to the Moabite women. Now, is that the pshat of the Torah? Meaning, is that what the Torah actually means? I would argue somewhere between unlikely and absolutely not. But it's an interesting thing because what they're basically saying is they're accusing him of kind of being so concerned with following the letter of the law that he loses perspective on the larger issue. And that's going to be an important thing for us when we turn in a minute to the story of Yehuda and Tamar, because basically what we see here is righteousness, as he understands it, causes him to be written out of history. And that it's Boaz who's able, I think he's kind of fallen for Ruth. She spent a night at his feet. So exciting. Who knows what happened while she was there. But in addition to that, he's sort of able to have the creativity in his mind, the halachic flexibility and creativity that allows him to see that maybe the reality is a little bit different from the way he perceives it at first. Okay? So we're gonna put Pliny to the side for a minute. We're gonna come back to him. And now I want to look at the story of Yehuda and Tamar. This is one of my favorite stories in all of Sefer Bereshit. I once had the pleasure of teaching a bat mitzvah student for Parshat Vayeshev, and she went to a Jewish school, but they had skipped over that parak because they always skip over that parak because it's uncomfortable because, right, people are dying because they don't want to have sex with their brother's wives, and then, someone dresses up as a prostitute and she gets pregnant by her father-in-law. It's sort of a seedy story. Sort of sordid story. And so she was like, wait, what? This is crazy. And she loved it. But I think it's actually a really amazing story, and especially when we talk about women in Tanakh, which is not something I generally talk about because that's not my field of expertise. But when we think about women of Tanakh, Tamar is an amazing, strong woman. And so I don't see shame in this story. I see her as an amazing hero who has the ability to kind of take a step back and understand the situation, and that gives her foresight. And we'll see as the story unfolds, but I actually think that God is very much on her side based on what happens. And I think that even though she's doing something that seems illicit, which we'll see in a minute, so if you're not with me, you'll be there in a minute, that she understands that sometimes you have to think outside of the system in order to make things work. So a little bit of background. Again, we're going to have this issue of Levirate marriage. So Yehuda, who is Yaakov's third son, he gets married. He has 3 sons. The first one marries Tamar. He does something evil in the eyes of God. It's not clear what it is. The story doesn't tell us. The rabbis comment that they think it's that he tries specifically not to get his wife pregnant because she's beautiful and he doesn't want to ruin her figure. So, okay, but whatever it is, God kills her. Kills him. Important. God kills him, not her. She is very much alive. So she then marries Yehuda's second son, who also, it seems, does not want to get her pregnant, not because he's worried about her figure, but because he's not interested in having a child who is not kind of his own for lineage purposes. So God kills him also. And so now Yehuda is left with a third son, whose name is Shelah. And he says to Tamar, go back to your father's house, and I'll send you Shelah when he gets old enough. But it becomes clear to Tamar that is actually not going to happen. And on one hand, you sort of feel like you can't blame Yehuda because his sons keep dying. But on the other hand, it's really a terrible thing he does to her because she's basically in a perpetual state of widowhood, but not in a way that allows her to remarry, because she's still technically bound by marriage in certain ways to her brother-in-law, to Shelah. And there's no out for her, essentially. So that's basically what's happening here. So can I get a volunteer, please, to read from Bereshit chapter 38?
וירבו הימים ותמות בת שוע אשת יהודה וינחם יהודה ויעל על גוזזי צאנו הוא בחירה ואלו הדולמית עינתה. ויגד תמר לאמור הנה חמיך עולת עינתה לגוז צאנו.
Okay, can you read the English for us now, please?
A long time afterwards, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died. When his period of mourning was over, Judah went up to Timnah to his sheep shears together with his friend Hira, the Adulamite. And Tamar was told, your father-in-law is coming up to Timnah for the sheep shears.
The sheep shearing is a big holiday. It's basically a giant festival, potentially sex party. There's sort of a lot going on. It's a very festive time. It's not just about shearing the sheep. Sex party, sure. Okay, well, we'll see. You'll see why I say that. Okay, so go ahead.
So she took off her widow's garb, covered her face with a veil, and, wrapping herself up, sat down at the entrance to Enai, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown up, yet she had not been given to him as wife. When Judah saw her, he took her for a harlot, for she had covered her face.
And this is something that's common in Tanakh. People sort of disguise themselves in ways that always amaze me. Oh, you had a cover on your face. I didn't recognize you. I don't know. There's always an element that surprises me. It's like, oh, you put on a tutu. You're a totally different person. So I don't know. But this is, covering face is a sign of prostitution. Yeah, right. And Shakespeare is a great example of it, that people sort of make very minor changes and suddenly nobody knows who they are. It's amazing. It's a literary tool.
So he turned aside to her by the road and said, "Here, let me sleep with you," for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law.
Which would be not allowed. The halachah, you're not allowed to have sex with your daughter-in-law. Okay, not that they have halachah. Well, okay, whether the avot kept the mitzvot is a conversation for another time. Okay, continue, please.
"What," she asked, "will you pay for sleeping with me?" He replied, "I will send a kid from my flock." But she said, "You must leave a pledge until you have sent it." And he said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, "Your seal and cord and the staff which you carry."
And what's significant about those three things? They are identifiable, right? Your seal is what you sign your name with. And so she's not asking for just, leave me your diamond earrings until you can send me the money. It's not really about collateral. She's thinking ahead. She wants identifying features from him.
He wants his wallet.
Yeah, she wants his wallet, exactly. His iPhone. I wouldn't give up my wallet so quickly. I don't know. If someone said to me, "Oh, I'll just hold on to your wallet until you can bring me the money," I would say, I don't think so. And this question of is there shame around issues of prostitution, I think is a really important one. It's interesting that this Torah kind of goes out of the way to tell us that Yehuda's wife has died and that he has gone through the mourning process for her and now he's gotten up from that mourning process. I do sometimes wonder if that's partly meant to make us judge him a little bit less harshly for what's about to happen. I do think it's sort of strange to give your main identifying features to someone, both because you need them and also because don't you maybe want to have those on you. So yeah, I think it's a really important point. I went bowling a month ago and they said, give us your driver's license and we'll give you the bowling shoes. And then when I give, that's partly because they assume, and I guess this is what Yehuda thinks also, they assume that my driver's license is more valuable to me than the bowling shoes, which is true because the bowling shoes always smell bad. And so what do I want with them anyway? And so this is a way to guarantee that you'll get it back. And I think that the reason why Yehuda doesn't react with more surprise to the fact that this is what Tamar asks for is if she actually is a prostitute and she actually wants to make sure that she's going to get paid, the best thing to do is ask him for something that he'll miss it if he doesn't have it. And now, it's not really the same as me giving them my driver's license at the bowling alley, though, because when I do that, I'm not actually going to leave the bowling alley without my driver's license, whereas Yehuda is kind of on his way on this trip, and he says, "Oh yeah, I'll send it later." And I get the sense that he's just sort of lonely, right? His wife has died, and he's been mourning for her, and he's sad about it, and he's just lonely, and here's this prostitute, and it's like a moment for him to kind of have some intimacy, and I don't know that he sort of puts as much thought into it as we are right now. That's kind of the way I read the story. I think he has physical needs, maybe some emotional needs, although going to a prostitute to fulfill your emotional needs is probably not the best move in the world. But that's sort of the way that I read it, yeah, is that he might have impaired judgment from alcohol. He also might just have impaired judgment from sort of the point where he is in his life right now. Okay, good. So let's read on, right? So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she conceived by him. And the fact that she conceives this quickly, that is why I said at the beginning, I think God is on her side in this story. Because they have sex once.
Say it again.
They have sex once, and so I think God is on her side, because usually people don't conceive when they have sex for the first time. I mean, sometimes they do. Use protection unless you're ready. Right, and and in Tanakh, there's a tremendous amount about women who are barren, women who are fertile. Often women who are hated are fertile, and women who are loved are barren. We see Sarai is barren, and into being Sarah. Rivka is barren. Rachel is barren. Leah is the only one who is not barren, although she is for a period. God closes her womb for a little while. And Tamar, we actually have no reason to believe that she's barren, necessarily, except that she's been married to these two people and has not had children. And I think that's part of the reason that the rabbis read it as they've been they've been spilling seed, they've been pulling out to ensure that she doesn't conceive. But it's amazing to me that the first time she has sex with Yehuda, the only time she has sex with Yehuda, we're going to see, all of a sudden, she's pregnant. And sorry to ruin the ending, but not only is she going to be pregnant, but she's going to be pregnant with twins. Now, what's the significance of twins? She has to replace two sons, right? It's not only replacing her original husband, it's also replacing the second husband. And so if we see the act of yibum, the act of marrying your in-law as being about carrying on the other brother's name, well, Yehuda having a sexual relationship with Tamar is actually not an appropriate thing for him to do. But if it's going to happen just once, this actually enables that both of the family names get carried on. Both of his sons who have died, their family names get carried on. I think that Tamar understands that this is what has to happen. I don't think Tamar wants to sleep with her father-in-law. I want to be clear about that. I don't think she's sort of like, oh, I've been waiting for this moment all along, and here it is. I think that Tamar, and this is something I talk about a lot in terms of outsiders who appear in the Bavli, but I think it's true in Tanakh as well, especially you see it with the Nevi'im, with the prophets. People who are a little bit outside often understand the situation a lot better than the people who are in it. Tamar has been sent back to her father's house. She knows what's happening. She understands that she's not going to get Shelah. Yehuda doesn't have to tell her that. And she also knows that she has a responsibility to her husband to carry her dead husband, or her dead husbands, I guess. Tamar has a terrible life, by the way. I just want to point that out. I don't think that she's looking for him because she's overcome by sexual desire for him. I think she's looking for him because she understands her responsibility to carry on the name of her dead husbands. And Yehuda is sort of shirking that because he wants to protect his last son. She understands the larger picture of what's happening. No, I think she's not dressing up as a prostitute because she wants to have sex with anyone who comes by. She's specifically looking for Yehuda. Yes. Okay, so will you read on for us, please, verse 19?
Then she went on her way. She took off her veil and again put on her widow's garb. Judah sent the kid by his friend the Adulamite to redeem the pledge from the woman, but he could not find it.
Right, he doesn't even go back. He sends someone else. And I think there is a little bit of a shame aspect in that, maybe, or maybe he just feels like this prostitute is below me, I can't be bothered. I think either are possible.
He inquired of the people of that town, where's the called prostitute, the one on day 9 by the road? But they said, there's been no prostitute here. So he returned to Judah and said, I couldn't find her. Moreover, the townspeople said, there's been no prostitute here. Judah said, let her keep them, lest we become a laughingstock. I did send her this kid, but you didn't find her.
He's really quick to give up his wallet. I don't know. It's sort of an interesting thing. I guess it's not the same as your social security number in that you can get a new one if you lose the first one. And I guess it's less difficult than kind of changing all your credit cards, which I have had to do, and it's a giant pain. But it's interesting that he sort of, whatever, fine, she can keep what I gave her. It doesn't matter to me. He sort of seems to not really care about it. Honor is a very important thing. Yael Leibowitz taught a class at Drisha this summer called Honor and Shame in Tanakh, because these things are so intimately connected with each other. And there's just this sense that kind of, he doesn't want people. I think he doesn't want everyone to know. And so I wonder if he also has a sense at this point that maybe he's been had, that something is going on that he doesn't totally understand, and his preference is to just not touch it anymore, that the trade-off isn't worth it. He doesn't want people to kind of mock him. Oh, you're looking so hard for that prostitute, right? What kind of person are you? And especially when you think about where this story appears in the larger context, this is actually an interruption in the middle of the Yosef narrative. And it seems sort of like someone just stuck it in there, but I actually think it's really intimately connected to, this is Yehuda's growing up process, but this shows you why Yehuda, who's supposed to be a leader among his brothers, I said before he's the third son, he's the fourth son, right, after Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, but they've all been kind of written off for a variety of reasons. Reuven, because he ends up having sex with one of Yaakov's maidservants, with Bilhah, and then Shimon and Levi because of what happens with Dinah. So Yehuda is kind of like the great white hope, and we see that he's not ready to be that. He's the one who says when the brothers want to sell Yosef, he's the one who says, let's not kill him, let's leave him in a pit. Well, that's actually worse. Fine, you don't want his blood on your hands. You think if you leave him in a pit that nothing's going to happen to him? And Reuven goes back to find him and sees that he's not there, but Yehuda seems to kind of am I my brother's keeper? Whatever, I'll leave him in the pit. I'm not going to kill him directly. And so this story, I think, is very much about how Yehuda kind of needs to grow into the person who's going to later go before Yosef and say, trust me, I understand what it's like, right? And he can go to Yaakov and say, I understand what it's like to lose a son. In fact, he lost 2 of them, but he's not ready to do that yet. Right now, he's concerned with his own shame. And until he can look at a bigger place, he can't be the Yehuda who makes us actually Yehudim, right? That's where it comes from. And that to me is what this story is doing here. But at this point, we're almost at the end of the story, but still at verse 23, he's not there yet. He's not ready. The point of these stories, I think, is not to say, oh, look at the Avot, they were perfect, because you certainly can't say that, but look at the Avot, they grow and mature. Yosef is known as Yosef HaTzadik, Yosef the righteous. If you look at him in the beginning, he's sort of the opposite. He's like the brown-noser giant pain. He's smug, he's obnoxious, he makes fun of his brothers, he baits them, he goes out of his way to make them look bad. This is the tzaddik. And it's not until he sort of grows into that role at the end of it. Well, he then sort of enslaves the Egyptians, so that's a conversation for another time. But in terms of his family, yeah, Yaakov's the same thing. You see this process of maturation, and that's really important. And this is Yehuda's piece of that. And that, I think, is a big part of why the story appears specifically where it does. Okay, so let's read on and see to the end.
About 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot. In fact, she is with child. Bring her out, said Judah, and let her be burned. As she was being brought out, she sent this message to her father-in-law. I am with child by the man to whom these belong. And she added, examine these. Whose seal and cord and staff are these? Judah recognized them and said, she is more in the right than I.
Right, Sadka mimeni. This is that famous phrase. Continue on.
Inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he was not intimate with her again.
Okay, good. Now I cut off, there's more to the story, which we'll look at the end. We're going to pause there for now. Tamar is awesome. And here's why. Because Tamar has no reason to have faith in people, in my view. Tamar has no reason to think that Yehuda will ever do anything good for her. She sort of, at this point, she must feel like she married into the wrong family. And, people, they keep dying, seemingly by, God keeps killing them. For God to care enough about you to kill you, what you're doing really is not so good. And now her father-in-law thinks she's a prostitute, doesn't even recognize her, sleeps with her, kind of leaves her for abandonment, and she still trusts him to do the right thing in the end, which is amazing. Because she doesn't go out and publicly shame him. She doesn't go out and say, this is the thing that was given to me by the man who impregnated me, and it belongs to my father-in-law Yehuda. Instead, she sends him a message and says, this is who it belongs to. And she trusts him to say, you're right. I was the one in the wrong in this situation. I think that that's an amazing thing. I think to be able to have that kind of faith in people after the experiences that she's had is incredibly beautiful. Maybe the fact that she's pregnant with his child is enough to make him, maybe he cares about that child even if he doesn't care about Tamar. But I think this is a really brave thing that she does here. This is a gutsy move because it really could have backfired on her. She's being taken out to be burnt. And at that moment, she sort of still is concerned with this idea that she doesn't want to shame him publicly. I don't know. I think it's amazing. I would want to shame him publicly. I sort of feel like he's made me suffer, and now I have him, and I don't trust him to do the right thing because he hasn't done the right thing up to this point. And so why am I going to take that risk? I'm going to go out publicly and say, this is the person it belongs to, and it's an identifier. This is Yehuda, my father-in-law. The issue is it's technically adultery. That's the problem. For prostitutes, there's no issue. Like consensual sex in any form between a non-married woman and a man to whom she is not related has no. But she is technically married to Shelah, which is confusing. And so the punishment for adultery is, I think it's actually stoning, usually not burning, but it is a death penalty case. It's not an accident that she asked for the cord, staff, and seal. Right. She knows that this is what's going to happen. To me, the risk is just in the not exposing him publicly. But that's part of what makes Yehuda, I think, say she's righteous. Because even when I have done the wrong thing, she is protecting my dignity. He has not behaved in a way that allows him to really merit dignity, and yet she protects it anyway. Tamar is smart. She is nothing if not smart. She is smart, and she is thoughtful, and she is calculating. And I don't mean calculating in a negative way, but she has anticipated every step of this. And I do sort of wonder, I said in the beginning that my sense is that she believes that God is on her side, and that her conceiving in the way that she does affirms that for her. And I kind of wonder if part of what's happening here is she is willing to take this risk because she believes that God is on her side, and therefore that God will kind of protect these children because she has done the right thing, if in the seemingly wrong way. And that idea of doing the right thing in the wrong way is actually going to become very important as we move forward. And I want to hear your comments, but I also, there's like a larger narrative to this year, so I want to make sure we get to the end. So we won't look at this forno inside, although I encourage you to look at it later if you're kind of interested in this. But basically what he says is that when Yehuda said, Sakami many, he basically says, I didn't realize that I had done the wrong thing. I had thought I had only done the right thing. She has clearly done the wrong thing, but her wrongness is what's going to lead to righteousness. It is the will of God that she will carry on my family name. And he's picking up on a Gemara and Horayot that we're going to look at the end. So let's go on to part 3. So now we've seen Ploni Almoni, we've seen Tamar, we've had 2 very interesting conversations, but they actually do come together. So it's not just me talking about 2 stories that I like, although it's that too. So this is the continuation of the story. This is the end of Breshit Lamed Chet. So Tamar, one of the interesting things in Tanakh is people are often pregnant with twins, and they never seem to know it. One of my friends once was pregnant, and she was just like, she's a small person, and she was just huge. And we were all like, wow, she's just, I mean, you don't say that to a pregnant person ever. But then it turned out, now she knew, but they hadn't told anyone, that she, in fact, was having twins, right? So you look different, but it is possible to kind of keep that secret. And obviously, they didn't have sonograms and kind of all of those things we have now. So often, people don't know they're having twins. Rivka finds out she's having twins only because Yaakov and Esav are fighting in her womb, and she kind of goes to find out what's going on. So in fact, what we have here, right, when the time came for her to give birth, there were twins in her womb. Surprise! Not just one baby, but 2. And this is what I was saying before, that to me this is intentional, the carrying on of both of the 2 men's names. While she was in labor, one of them put out his hand. And you cannot read this story and not see echoes of the Yaakov and Esav story. It's impossible, right? One of them put out his hand, and the midwife tied a crimson thread around it, which Esav, right, the red, to signify this one came out first. Just then, he drew back in his hand, and out came his brother. So they're kind of, it's a little bit unclear who's the firstborn and who's the secondborn, because the hand came out first, but then the other baby actually came out fully. And she said, what a breach you have made for itself. And the word in Hebrew is paratzta. So therefore, he was named Peretz. And Peretz is going to become a very important figure in the book of Ruth. Not in that he appears, as he is long dead at that point, but he is actually the first step of lineage given leading to David HaMelech. It starts with Peretz. And afterwards, his brother came out whose hand had the crimson thread, and he was named Zerach, because Zerach has to do with shining. So this is the story. So her 2 children are born. I would like to think that Yehuda is like around and taking care of them, and the Torah doesn't tell us because that's not really the point. What's interesting about the characters of Peretz and Zerach is they don't really get a voice in the narrative. They sort of disappear. So they're born here, and they get mentioned later on when there are lineages given while the Jews are in the Midbar in terms of the counting, but we don't know anything about them. They're different in that way from Yosef's sons, Ephraim and Menashe, who receive a bracha from Yaakov. Peretz and Zerach, they're around. But they're actually incredibly important, Peretz specifically, in terms of the long-term future of the Jewish people, more so in certain ways than the people whose characters get played out. What we see in the 4th chapter of Ruth, this is at the very end of Sefer Ruth, and I try every year to lane the 4th parak because I love this. So Ruth and Boaz, they marry, they have this child, and Naomi kind of is the surrogate mother of this child, which is interesting, because the child sort of belongs to her dead son, right, which is a weird thing about it. It's one of the weird things about Yibum. And the women neighbors came to him and gave him a name saying, a son is born to Naomi, which is, it's interesting, but for another time. And they named him Oved. He was the father of Yishai, of Jesse, who is the father of David. So Ruth, HaMoaviyah, the Moabite, who is not even supposed to marry, she is the great-grandmother, yes, I just want to make sure I was counting correctly. She is the great-grandmother of one of the greatest kings of Jewish history, and also the great-great-grandmother of Shlomo HaMelech, who builds the Beit HaMikdash. And I think that there's something incredibly beautiful about the fact that the Beit HaMikdash comes from someone who was outside, right? And that there was a space made for her. And that, especially when you think of the fact that Boaz comes from the relationship between Yehuda and Tamar, which we're going to see in a minute, right? This is the line of Peretz. So this is how the genealogy starts. Peretz begot, you gotta love that word, begot Cherzon, Cherzon begot Ram, Ram begot Aminadav, Aminadav begot Nachshon, also a very interesting character. I have a lot to say about him another time. Nachshon begot Salmon, Salmon begot Boaz, Boaz begot Oved, Oved begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David. So what we see, I think it's interesting that it doesn't go back to Yehuda. When we give this lineage, it doesn't go back to Yehuda, it goes back to Peretz. And I think I don't think that that's an accident, because Peretz is Yehuda's son, but really Peretz is Tamar's son. And we're going to see in a minute that Peretz gets linked to Tamar in a way that he does not get linked to Yehuda. And that is because it is Tamar's vision that I think that enables Peretz to be born, right? If Yehuda has his way, his parentage is a little bit complicated because he's sort of Yehuda's son, but he's sort of Yehuda's grandson, meaning for purposes of inheritance, he's Yehuda's grandson. But I think that the Tanakh really sees Peretz as Tamar's child. I think that he's really linked to his mother, much more so than his father, because his mother was the one who intentionally went out and sort of broke the rules in order to make him come. She thought the whole thing up. And this, I think that it takes a long time to sort of, for her to get this affirmation. But what you see when you look at the end of the book of Ruth is this, to me, is an affirmation, at least in the eyes of the author of this book, that she did exactly the right thing. Because the fact that we go back to Peretz and we end up at David, and that later Mashiach is going to come from this, I think is a tremendously important thing. So we've been looking at chapter 4 kind of out of order. So this is the middle part of chapter 4. The part that we skipped in the 4th chapter is what we're going to look at right now. And this is one of my favorite verses in Tanakh because my name is Rachel Leah. And so we'll see why we like this part in a minute.
And Boaz said to the elders and to the rest of the people, "You are witnesses today that I am acquiring from Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilon and Mahlon. I am also acquiring Ruth the Moabite, the wife of Mahlon, as my wife, so as to perpetuate the name of the deceased upon his estate, that the name of the deceased may not disappear from among his kinsmen and from the gate of his hometown. You are witnesses today."
Okay, and I'm going to pause you there for 1 minute. And I do want to note that if you go back to the genealogy, Oved is called the son of Boaz. He's not called the son of Chilon, which I want to, in light of, complicated parentage, who does this child belong to, etc., he's tied to Boaz, because Boaz is the one who sort of steps up. So for inheritance purposes, he gets the land of his deceased, I don't even know, like cousin who would have been his father. It's confusing. I don't know. Yibum is one of the most confusing things that there is. If you ever learn Masechet Yevamot, you know that. But the child is given to the person, is associated with his grandmother and with his actual biological father. Okay, so what do the people say when they hear this?
So, all the people at the gate and the elders answered, "We are. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built up the house."
Yes. Very exciting for me. Okay, keep going.
"Prosper in Ephraim and perpetuate your name in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, through the offspring which the Lord will give you by this young woman."
Okay, good. So who are the people that we're referencing in the bracha that they're giving to Ruth and Boaz? Rachel and Leah? Peretz, Tamar, and Yehuda, but I think really Peretz and Tamar. And I don't want to minimize the fact that Yehuda is mentioned there. I think it is significant, but first of all, it's a reminder of the fact that Yehuda was the father of this child, which actually, right, this is another case where you think these people maybe shouldn't be getting married, and look what happened. And the fact, blessing like Rachel and Leah, that's a common thing. When you bless daughters on Friday night, you traditionally evoke the 4 imahot, right? May Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah, thank you. And when I was a kid, my name is Rachel, Leah, as I said, and my sisters are Rebecca and Sarah. And so I always wondered, do you fill in the names of whoever you're blessing? But then I realized when I got a little bit older that no, actually, that's just what everyone says. It's confusing. Because I was like, oh, those are our names, and I get 2. I don't know why, but that's great for me. So anyway, but Rachel and Leah, because they're the ones who build Bnei Yisrael in terms of children, right? The generation that they bear mark the transition from family to peoplehood, right? Those are the people who go down to Egypt. We're told they go down kind of in this group, and when they leave as 600,000 men. And so this is the moment of transition. But I think it's also interesting that they reference Peretz and Tamar and Yehuda here, and it's partly because that's their lineage. That's the lineage of Boaz. But I think also it's a reminder, sort of a little bit, to Ploni Almoni, that yes, the halakha says X, but sometimes you have to have a little bit of creativity and imagination. Because when you have that creativity and imagination, look what happened with Yehuda and Tamar. She almost got taken out to be burnt for idolatry. And she had sex with her father-in-law, which she's not really allowed to do because she's technically married to his son. It's like a confusing situation. But she's able to kind of take the step back and realize that there's a bigger point, and that's what Boaz is able to do also. And I think I like to read that Boaz has fallen in love with Ruth. That's the degree to which love exists in Tanakh. I think it's a modern notion of romance, but I like to think of it that way, and I'm gonna let myself have it. But part of what you see in all of this is that he also understands that sometimes there's more than just the system, right? And I called this class, the subtitle of it is a characterization of wisdom and halachah. Because part of what happens is sometimes what you look around and see as right is a little bit complicated in the eyes of halachah. And this is not my way of kind of saying, first of all, recognizing that everyone in this room has a different relationship with Jewish law and what that might mean to them. But this is not my way of saying, and therefore we throw out halachah when it kind of contradicts wisdom to us. But instead, that what we see is that there is a sense that sometimes you have to be flexible. You have to be able to think outside of the system, right? And that's what Tamar does, and that's also what Boaz does. And this last piece, it comes from the Talmud Bavli Masachet Horayot, and it's actually commenting on this idea of, they say adultery, and this is Sansino's translation, and adultery isn't really the right word because the word is zinta in Hebrew, which has to do with really harlotry. And it references two people. So one of the people it references is Tamar, and the other one is Zimri, who is one of the characters in the story, that story of Pinchas. And the parallel in those stories is you have people of Yisrael and people of Moab who are kind of having these sexual relationships. Not with Tamar, but in terms of Boaz and Ruth. But so Ula says, Amar Ula, Tamar committed adultery, harlotry, again, I think is a better definition, and Zimri also committed harlotry. Tamar committed harlotry, and kings and prophets came from her. Zimri committed harlotry, and many thousands of Israel fell because of him, right? Because there's a tremendous plague that gets sent over the people, and one of the things that the commentators say when they look at the story of Zimri and Cosby is that Zimri was actually a prince. He was a prominent figure within the people, and so when they saw him having sex with this woman, they were like, oh great, that means we can also have sex with these women, and we can also engage in idolatry, and because that's what our leaders are doing, and so that's a great thing to do. And because of that, this plague strikes the people, and it's not until Pinchas goes in kind of this great moment of zealotry that he goes in and he stabs both of them while they're in the middle of the sexual act, interestingly giving him after that the Brit Shalom, the covenant of peace, which I find fascinating, and again, for maybe next year, we'll talk about that another time. But until that action, there's a plague that's just wiping out the people. And so on one hand, you have two people who seem to have committed the same sort of sin, right? Illicit sexual relationships. One of them, kings and prophets, the other one, a plague. So what do we make of this? So this is Ula's issue. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, a sin done with good intentions is greater than a mitzvah done without good intentions. And I'll read you the Hebrew here. Gedola avera lishma memitzvah shelo lishma. I just let that sit with you for a minute. That's a big deal, what he just said. That is a big deal, what he just said. And he actually has a proof for this. What's his proof? Of all the women, let Yael be the most blessed, the wife of Chaver the Keni, the most blessed of all the women of the tents. This is referencing the story of Dvorah. And Yael, she brings Sisera into her tent. And the rabbis assume that she has sex with him basically until he's exhausted, and then she takes a tent pin and drives it into his head. And the reason why I mentioned that rabbinic reading is because you need to see it that way in order to understand what her Aveirah is. So her Aveirah is that she has sex with this man who is not her husband, but she does it lishma. It's not really lishma, it's so that she can exhaust him and therefore kill him. But I would translate lishma here instead of being for its own sake, which is usually how we talk about it, like Torah lishma. Instead of saying lishma in that way, I would say lishma here means with a sense that there's a greater issue that I need to have perspective on, And therefore, sometimes the rules are different from what I'm told that they are. And I want to point, this is a very dangerous thing, what I'm saying. Very dangerous. Because who am I to say I can't just take matters into my own hand? And this is something the Jewish community struggles with. This is something other religious communities struggle with. It's a very dangerous thing to say. But when it works, when you're right, the problem is you don't know in advance if you're going to be right. When you're right, I don't know what to make of the fact that this is what Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says, but this is what he says, right? Gedola avera lishma mitzvah shalom lishma. Right? And they say, who are these women of the tents? Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah. The Yael is an inheritor of the tradition of the Imahot. That Tamar is an inheritor of the tradition of the Imahot. And that it's those who are able to stop and look around and say, this is what the rule is, but this is what's right in the world, and who are able to have that sort of creativity and vision, that they are the ones who lead to Mashiach. So it's dangerous. It's a dangerous thing that I'm saying, and I don't want to minimize that. And this is not my way of saying, so therefore the laws don't apply to you, whether Jewish or otherwise, and go out and do whatever you want. That's not my point. But my point is that we often think of these systems as very rigid, and the rabbis are actually not looking at them this way, at least in this case. And it's partly because they're trying to solve a problem that they see in these stories. The story of Tamar is a problem. The story of Ruth is a problem, and they're trying to solve those problems. But the fact that they do it by suggesting that sometimes there's such thing as an Aveira Lishma, I think is an incredibly beautiful message. So, you have to take it with a grain of salt, because, again, this is not my way of saying, so therefore go out and do whatever you want. But the idea that there is wisdom that exists beyond halakha, and that's something that we have to access in order to kind of bring Mashiach into the world, I think is a really beautiful thing.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.